University is here to help you. My name is Raymond. I will be moderating this event today, and the weather looks very dark and gloomy. I hope the internet lines don't give up on us. I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Her name is Miss Elaine Fernandez. She is the head of the university's Department of Psychology. She's a social psychologist by training, and she is one of HELP's own products. She was our student many, many years ago. I won't tell you how long ago, that will give away her age. She's passionate about making psychology practical and accessible to the people of various backgrounds, and devotes much of her time to helping people develop the psychological resources needed to cope with life's challenges. She has conducted many workshops on stress management, emotional intelligence, conflict communication, and classroom management. She strongly advocates for evidence-based approach to understanding human needs and behaviors, particularly in diverse contexts. So in line with this, she founded the Department of Psychology's Center for Diversity, where in collaboration with the Center for Work Psychology and the Center for Emotions and Health University, she has published work on leadership, diversity, and peer-reviewed publication, including research on emotions in organizations and political psychology. So she is really one of our brightest young leaders at HELP University. Assisting me today will be two of my colleagues, Ms. Yoga, who's having a bit of a problem with her mic at the moment, and Mr. Greg from the marketing department where I work at. So right now, I would like to just remind all of you, please mute your mics, you turn off your cameras, listen to the session by Ms. Elaine, list your questions in the chat box, and we will come to the questions halfway. Elaine will be speaking for roughly about 15 to 20 minutes first, and then she'll open the floor to questions, and then she'll continue with round 2 of the session, and then there will be more questions at the end. Thank you very much. You can take it away, Elaine.
Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We will be talking about the various methods that we can use to cope with stress. They'll be sort of what we usually do with stress management anyway, but obviously some of these will be a little bit more amplified given some of the differences in the situations we find ourselves now. So I'll be covering about 8 different methods and going into a little bit of detail as to why some of these methods, even though they might seem a little bit common sense, how these methods actually can work to help us manage our stress as well. All right, so I'll be sharing my slides with you. So I will be disappearing off your screens while the presentation is ongoing. You'll be able to hear me, but you won't be able to see me. But if you have any questions along the way, as Raymond has mentioned, just put them in the chat. I will stop about halfway through the presentation to address any questions you might have about the content up to that point. If you have questions that I will address in the latter half of the presentation, I will let you know. And then after that, you can see if you still want me to go into further detail about the question that you have. All right. So I'm going to share the slides with you just now, and then I will start the presentation itself. All right. Okay, so before we go into the stress management methods, I would first like to just share with you what stress is and how we typically experience that. So stress, although we use this word a lot, is really a physiological response to any uncertainties or any perceived threats in our environment. So at any point when we feel like we're losing control over a situation, or we are unsure as to how to proceed, these are factors that can create in us a sense of stress. So the physiological response is very much in line with the evolutionary fight or flight responses, where you have elevated heart rates, increased cortisol levels, and so on. And this gives us a sense that we need to act in order to reduce that feeling of urgency, of threat. Now, we respond to what we call stresses. And these stresses can be proximal, meaning that they are directly in our environment and they're affecting us directly as well, or they can be distal. So distal means they're sort of further away, but they do have an impact on the way we are perceiving a particular situation. So examples of proximal stresses are unexpected problems at work. You know, you start off a day thinking, okay, today looks fine. And then as you go along, something happens and then your whole day gets derailed. So that's an example of a proximal stressor that happens directly to us. Our children might be feeling anxious and misbehaving. We are worried about day-to-day resources, perhaps. Those are proximal stresses that impact us directly on a day-to-day basis. Distal stresses, we don't pay attention to as much sometimes, but they could also have an impact on our overall perception of threat. So things like the economic conditions, our worries about are we going to be able to save up as much to send our kids where they want to go. If our kids want to go overseas, is that now going to be an option given the current global conditions? The travel restrictions that limit our options. Some of us might be paying a lot of attention to the daily cases, the increase in cases, what's going on there. So all of these are also stressful because they are outside of our control. But we sometimes don't realize how these kinds of stresses can impact us as well, because they're sort of distant, a bit further away from us, but because we're thinking about them, they're also creating this sense of uncertainty, this sense of impending threat that we sometimes find it hard to get away from. So stresses can come in various forms, and sometimes we may not always be aware of precisely what is stressing us out at a given point in time. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but generally speaking, in order to help us manage the different stresses in our lives, it's important to also have the time to sort of identify where these stresses are coming from. That's the first step to being able to manage these stresses effectively. But I will go into more detail in a minute. So moving on, sometimes as well, because we're so busy and our attention is, you know, split in different directions, especially now when we're at home and it's very difficult to sort of compartmentalize. Again, I'll be talking about that later, but it's difficult for us to recognize when we might be stressed. So some signs of stress are your sleeping patterns are becoming a little bit more unusual. Either you're sleeping too long or sleeping too little. You might be feeling a little bit more tired throughout the day. You might be taking naps when you previously were not, or you might be staying up and unable to fall asleep. So that's an indicator that you might be experiencing stress. You might also be feeling emotional, more so than usual. Some people experience difficulty concentrating. Previously, you were able to focus, but now you're finding it difficult to do so. You might, as a result, also feel like you are your rope is a little bit shorter, so it's easier for you to get annoyed or frustrated than you normally would be. There's also procrastination, the feeling of putting off work that you normally would have no issue dealing with immediately. A sense of low mood or moodiness, difficulty enjoying things that you previously did. So if you had previously enjoyed cooking or baking and then suddenly you find that you don't really feel like doing it anymore, or when you do it, you don't get that same sense of contentment. There might be a sense of low energy as well. And you might feel like you're more prone to falling sick, because one thing that stress does, especially chronic stress, is it weakens the immune system because of the high levels of the hormone cortisol, which over periods of time can actually make us more susceptible to illnesses and things like that. So given the nature of the symptoms of stress, and you can see a lot of them are somewhat physical in nature, it's important that we find ways to effectively manage this stress, because the implications are beyond just sort of the psychological, I feel down or I feel upset all the time, it also has an impact on our physical body. So today, I will be going into 8 general tips on how to deal with stress. I will stop after tip number 4 for you to put some questions to me if you have any. And then once we go through those questions, then I'll continue with number 5 to 8. So moving quickly into the first tip, the one thing that we sometimes find difficult to do in our day-to-day lives, and it's especially exacerbated, I think, now during the MCO, is that our different roles and responsibilities become sort of overlapping. I think Raymond mentioned earlier that it was difficult to tell what day of the week it is sometimes because all the days sort of blend into each other. So it is one of the challenges during the MCO period that we maybe are starting to allow our boundaries to slip a little bit because we are at home all the time and we're doing our work at home, we're handling our household responsibilities at home, family time at home, and so on. So the importance of creating boundaries is that it helps us plan, that's one thing, but it also gives us a certainty of what we need to do at a particular point in time. So it helps us to compartmentalize our days into manageable chunks and allows us to then concentrate on what we need to do at a given point in time based on the activity that we've assigned to that chunk. So what we want to avoid is really having our attention split in many different directions because that creates a lot of cognitive load and makes it very difficult for us to really perform any of those tasks to the degree of satisfaction that we usually want. So the first very important reason for creating the boundary is just to help us create spaces in our day that allows us to focus on what we need to do and then gives us enough time, therefore, to handle the different responsibilities that we have. The other important point about creating boundaries is the boundary isn't just for us, it's also for the people around us to understand that we need that space and that we need also for people to respect that space. Because sometimes people want to do that, they want to give us what we need as far as, maybe some personal time and things like that. But because we haven't communicated these things to them, they're also uncertain as to whether or not they're crossing certain boundaries with us. And if we haven't made that clear, we also struggle with then saying no because sometimes we feel bad for saying no, especially if it's work related or it's to do with our children or our spouse. So having clear boundaries gives everybody a sense of clarity as to when you allocate a certain time for a certain activity, people are aware, you are also aware, and therefore it gives you a little bit more license to take that time and focus on that particular activity. So the boundaries that we want to create can be across several different dimensions. So it can be between our work life and our personal life. So for example, if you have children or if you're the person in the house who does the cooking, so lunch hour is possibly a very important time for you to maybe be allowed to take that 1 hour to concentrate on preparing lunch for yourself as well as your family. Then it's something to maybe communicate to your boss or your colleagues that, okay, between the hours of 12:30 to 1:30, I would appreciate if that time was given to me to just look after my family's lunch, and then I'll come back to work and be on from 1:30 till whatever time work is supposed to end. So creating that very clear sense that between this time, I'm very unlikely to be able to respond to messages. I will respond to everything when I come back at 1:30. So that's an example.
Elaine, can I just ask a quick question? Sorry to
Sure.
disturb
Yeah,
you.
go ahead.
Would you be able to share your slides with the attendees later on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so.
So everyone, you don't have to take down notes. We will share the slides with you later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Raymond. Okay, then the other thing that you might want to think about as well is setting a boundary between what is your time, so doing things that are important to you. It could, I mean, it could very well be housework. That's up to you. But it could also be doing something that you enjoy, or even just sitting down for 15 minutes with a cup of tea, just to sort of clear your head and take a break to relax. Also explaining to your family that that might be something that you need, and also taking time for and then telling them, okay, in 15 minutes time, I'll be available to come and play with you or help you with your homework or something, but just for these 15 minutes I need some time to take my mind off work and switch gears even. Another boundary that we want to create as well is between online and offline time. I think during this MCO, a lot of us are spending too much time on our devices. My iPhone just told me that I spent almost 13 hours on screen time in the last week, which is terrible. It's more than half the day. So these are things that we need to pay attention to and actively create the differentiation between online versus offline time. So saying really between the hours of 6 and 7 or 6 and 8, where I want to devote my time to maybe spending time with my family or doing something that's creative, or even doing ironing or whatever. This is a time where I will not be checking my phone and things like that. So you can even communicate that to other people to say, don't worry about me if you can't contact me between 6 and 7, because I'm not going to be checking my phone during this period of time, in order to give myself a break from being online. And likewise, if you have specific tasks that need to be completed, sort of assigning them their own little role throughout the day would be important, because sometimes we try to multitask. So on the one hand, we are trying to prepare a spreadsheet for work while we're keeping an eye on our child's homework and doing a whole lot of things at the same time. If at all possible, and I know that sometimes it's not completely possible, but where you can, identifying those tasks that you can actually separate into smaller chunks of time, and then focus on one thing at a time. Because we know from psychological research that multitasking actually doesn't work for most people. In fact, it creates, as I mentioned earlier, a greater cognitive load and makes it more difficult for us to do things efficiently, and we're also more likely to make mistakes. So if wherever possible, if we can compartmentalize the tasks that we need to do, that would be very helpful in helping us reduce the amount of stress we feel as a result of feeling our attention being dragged in too many different directions. Okay, moving on to the second point. A very important factor, I think, in the stress that we experience, especially when it comes to stress that comes from relationships, is a lack of communication, or a lack of effective communication. So one of the things that we need to pay attention to, especially since we are really with our families 24/7 now, there is no individual activities outside the house and so on, so that people can get their space. So it's even more important that we learn how to communicate and engage with each other constructively. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that it's important to avoid making assumptions about why people are acting a certain way, especially when it comes to children and teenagers. Sometimes what's on the surface isn't necessarily what's really happening. So a rude or a bored teenager may not actually be intending to be rude. It might be coming from somewhere where they're feeling a degree of discomfort, but they don't know how to express it appropriately. So it's important, if you notice anomalies in behavior, or people are not really being themselves, to at least avoid passing judgment before we have a chance to approach them and try and see what's happening with them. Especially now, I think a lot of children have trouble articulating how they're feeling, because it's such a very different situation than any of us are used to. I think even adults are finding it difficult to properly say how they're feeling about the situation. So more so with children who lack the vocabulary or the experience to really share this, it might be important to spend a little bit more time talking to them to see where the source of certain behaviors are coming from. In light of that as well, it's important that we try and be as open as possible with the people that we're living with, in terms of how we are feeling as well. So they see that you are willing to share how you feel, and it might give them a sense that they also can do so without feeling like you might get angry with them or they might be judged. So especially older children who can understand that this might be a stressful situation for other people, it's good that they also recognize that this, you are also not exactly having an easy time of it, and it can help them to develop a sense of empathy, and it also might help them cooperate better with you when you need them to do so, because then they can understand where the requests are coming from. Not that you're trying to be very strict or a dictator or a tyrant or whatever, sometimes how children can interpret our actions, but it's coming from a place where you actually need them to cooperate in order for the day to run a little bit more smoothly. And I think a lot of children, for the most part, do try and understand as well. Another thing that we can do is that might help to minimize some of the disruptions throughout the day is to teach children how to resolve conflict between themselves. So have conversations with them about listening with empathy, or taking the other person, their sibling's perspective in an argument, teaching them how to be constructive in the feedback, how to communicate what they want without throwing tantrums or without screaming, teaching them to be compassionate towards each other, helping them try to understand what their sibling is going through. These are things that if we can teach our children how to resolve conflict between themselves, it might take away one layer of involvement that we have to have should there be any disputes between them, because they already have some resources on how to deal with that amongst themselves. Other things that we can do as well to sort of minimize, their reactions to things that we ask them to do is involve them in the discussions about how the family is going to operate, how chores are going to be divided, how behaviors are going to be dealt with. So you can even talk to them about what they think appropriate consequences should be in the event that they misbehave. So they are coming up with the consequences, and therefore they will take more ownership over their own behaviors. And you will find that they might be less resistant if, let's say, they do misbehave and then you apply a consequence for them. They tend to be a little bit more responsive that way, and even if they're not happy. So basically, if the underlying theme here is that if people can understand where we're coming from, and we're not afraid to sort of give them explanations or justifications, and also model for them certain behaviors like how to be open, how to be empathetic, how to listen to them, then they also see that if you can do that for them, they might also be more willing to try and model that behavior as well. So children learn vicariously, and they see how we are with the people around us. So if we can engage people constructively in our environments, it's something that they will learn to do as well. Now, I think this is one of those tips that we see a lot, and there's a reason for that. Especially in times like this where there is no clear boundary between work and home life and so on, it's very easy for the day to kind of blend into itself, and then we are not sure when we're supposed to be doing what and trying to remember what comes next and so on. It can get very, very stressful because that makes things more uncertain throughout the day. So if possible, try and create as specific a routine as possible. if you can include times throughout the day, but make sure you allocate a little bit more time for each activity than you think you might need, because more often than not, we do take more time than we think we need. So incorporate that already into your timetable, and make sure that your routine doesn't just schedule in work. So whether it's your child's schooling and your own work or homework time or housework, also include options for the fun time, the me time, and things like that. So people know when they expect, okay, so if I finish my homework by this time, I'm allowed to play my video games for an hour. So they have something to anticipate and look forward to. And they know that you are not begrudging them that time. It's not that you're expecting them to just be doing work all day. They have a time that's already been given to them to explore the activities that they want to entertain themselves or to unwind. And likewise, it also gives you some time to do the things that are important for you. And your children also know, and your children, your spouse, whoever else you're living with, they also know that that time is also dedicated for you to pursue things that are important to you, whatever those might be. And where possible, if your children are old enough as well, you can get them involved in coming up with this routine. Once again, involving them gives them more ownership over the outcome, and therefore they're much more likely to adhere to it than if we were to impose a routine on them. So if they have some say and they can see that some of their interests and their ideas have been incorporated into the routine, they are more likely to be cooperative and follow the routine accordingly. Okay, before we take questions, I'm just going to go through one more. And this is about reappraisal. So reappraisal is basically finding other ways to think about a situation. When we are stressed and when we encounter difficulties, it's very easy for us to be overwhelmed by the emotion it creates. So whether it's anger, hurt, frustration, these are always going to be the initial responses, which is completely fine. It's very natural that when we encounter a problem, our response is going to be some sort of negative emotion. However, just allowing the negative emotion to sit and only focusing on the emotion is not really going to be very helpful in helping us reduce stress, and also in finding solutions that can help to alleviate the problem. So what we want to do when we encounter difficult situations is first take a breath. A very important thing to remember is that if we want to respond constructively, the first thing we need to do is not react. So reactions are immediate responses that often, because we are already stressed out, can be more intense than we intend them to be. And can be out of proportion to what actually happens. So whenever we encounter a problem, it helps to sort of stop first, take a breath, identify what we're feeling, and acknowledge the feeling as well. Because sometimes we feel the need to suppress or push away negative emotion, and suppression doesn't help because it just ends up with the emotion building up, and later on it becomes very difficult to manage. So whenever we feel a negative emotion, it's a good idea to stop and see whether we can identify that emotion. Okay, right now I'm feeling quite hurt because my spouse just accused me of not doing much all day, right? So you've identified the emotion as being hurt and identified the cause of the emotion as something that your spouse has said to you, right? Now, after that, we don't want to just go, oh, okay, then how can he be so unfair to me? He's also not doing this. Although that might be a valid assessment, it's also not a helpful one because it doesn't lead to some kind of solution. So we can acknowledge that we have those thoughts, but it's also then important to take some time to think about, okay, how come he's saying that? What, apart from the fact that he's being unfair, could there be some other reason that he is lashing out at me? what might he be going through that I may not have noticed? Is it possible that he is lacking some perspective when it comes to what we're doing at home, right? So it might be a situation where you want to then think about, okay, what is the best way to engage him once I have thought about the possible reasons for why he said something that is potentially quite out of character for him, or he said something in anger that is actually unfair. So then once you've already processed the hurt, you know that when you talk to him, you're not going to be reacting from the basis of hurt. You're going to be a little bit more detached. And the purpose would then be to try and understand where the comment came from, in order to see if there's anything that we can do to resolve that conflict. And by acknowledging that you're hurt as well to yourself, it's also easier to then communicate to him that what he said was also hurtful, because you know exactly the consequence of what he said. So the conversation becomes a lot clearer, and the outcome that you want from the conversation also will be a lot clearer for you. So this process is important to helping us find ways to communicate around the emotion that we are experiencing at a given point in time. Okay, I'm done with tip number 4. I'm going to come back online for you to ask me questions.
Okay, Elaine.
Hi.
Yes.
All right.
There's
There's a question from LKW. LKW, would you like to pose a question directly to Elaine?
Please unmute your mic.
Okay, the question goes like this, Elaine.
Okay.
If that person is stubborn and doesn't respect our boundaries, so what happens?
Okay, so it really depends on who the person is. If they're your bosses and things like that, it might be a little bit difficult, but it might just require you to assert the boundary. So again, your individual situations are going to be quite different from each other. But in general, if somebody is not respecting the boundary, we don't respond, right? So meaning if I tell my colleague, okay, between the hours of 3 and 4, I'll be focusing on this particular work. Therefore, I will not be responding to any WhatsApp messages or emails during this time. If the person wants to WhatsApp me, or if the person wants to email me, I just won't respond between 3 to 4, for example. So where possible, we can assert our boundaries in that way, meaning that we maintain the boundary. We don't let the other person cross the boundary. If they're upset with us, it's a decision that we have to make, that we are not always going to be able to please people, and that people pleasing or making other people feel good sometimes is a detriment to our mental health, our mental state. So we need to prioritize ourselves, and that's not a selfish thing. Because if we are stressing ourselves out trying to meet the demands of the people around us, eventually we will have nothing left to give, and then that will be an even bigger issue. We won't be able to provide them with the support that they need when they need it. So again, this requires a little bit of judgment on our side, in terms of the maintenance of boundaries. But wherever possible, we want to be the ones to maintain those boundaries. So if somebody's trying to cross them, we just don't let them, where we can. That's generally how we would approach this situation. If it's a child, it depends again on how old they are and whether they're able to understand why you have a boundary. Might be worth talking to them if it's somebody that you can talk to as well, to explain the need for the boundary. So again, it really depends who this person is and whether they're in a position to affect you in some kind of meaningful way. So like with the boss and all of that, I understand why it's difficult. But yeah, it's generally speaking, where we can try and assert the boundary.
Thank you, Elaine,
Thanks,
for
Elaine.
that illuminating answer. Does anyone have any other questions you'd like to ask Elaine?
That was a really good question, by the way, and a very important one. It's not always that easy. I completely understand why you asked.
Yeah. Anyone has any other questions? Okay, if there's none, I think Elaine, you can continue with the second part.
Okay, so moving on, something that is very important, especially now during this time of crisis, is we want to try and reduce our exposure to negativity. So it's very important. I think we kind of know this, but it's also sometimes it's difficult not to keep an eye on what's going on in the world. And I completely understand that. But the reason why we advise, especially if you are feeling stressed by these events, reducing your exposure to negative news, negative information is necessary in order to help reduce our sensitivity to threat. So when we focus a lot on the negative, what happens is that our minds become very attuned to further negativity, and that's what we end up paying more attention to. When we do that, we start perceiving threats more easily, and when we perceive threat more easily, that makes us stressed out even more easily. So it's a sort of slippery slope from looking at negative news a lot towards then being very easily stressed out the next time something happens that is minusculely negative. Yeah. So the consequence as well of developing what we call negative mental filters, meaning that the way we perceive the world is becoming more and more negative, is that it could lead to chronic stress and anxiety because we are constantly in a state of uncertainty and a state of threat perception. So especially now when there's a lot of negative news out there, we want to try and manage that so that we are not constantly paying attention to things that are, one is beyond our control entirely, so the sort of situation outside is not something that we can directly impact. So we want to maybe draw our attention away from that to focus on things that are within our control. Yeah. So a few ways that we can limit our exposure to negativity is, one is limit our time spent consuming news. So rather than checking news portals throughout the day, looking at Facebook for updates and stuff like that, we can maybe schedule a time during the day where maybe in the morning when you're having your coffee, or in the evening after dinner, maybe you just want to have a look at what the updates are throughout the day, but limiting it to those 2 times where you actually look at the news, and telling yourself, okay, I will only spend half an hour at each time in order to deal with this. Another thing we can do as well is that if we know that there are groups in our WhatsApp chat or people on our Facebook pages or social media pages that consistently post things that are negative in nature, we can choose to maybe mute those group chats until the time where we want to look at news, or we can choose to unfollow these individuals for the time being until the crisis has passed, just so that we are not passively exposed to this information as well. Something else we can also do is to do things like avoid what I like to call worry Googling, where we, every time something happens that might be a little bit out of character or might feel a little bit off, we then put the symptom into Google and see what's wrong with us, or what's wrong with our children or our spouse. So we want to avoid doing that because a lot of the time it can lead us to catastrophize. Because whenever we put symptoms and stuff like that into Google, the pages that are going to come up are not going to tell you that this symptom is benign, because they're usually tagged to particular issues that people might have. So it could exacerbate the feelings of anxiety if we start to put into searches everything that feels wrong throughout the day. So it's something that we can try and manage as well. Unless something is very wrong, or we feel that something is very wrong, it might be an idea to just let those symptoms pass, or even talk to the person to see if there's any explanation from them why they might be behaving a certain way before we go to Google. And then another thing that can happen sometimes during this period is that when we are on social media, we are constantly being exposed to what other people are doing. And the nature of social media is such that people don't typically post the problems that happen throughout the day. Usually they will post things that they are happy with, that they were satisfied with, that give them some kind of pleasure. So we are actually exposed to these images or videos of people who are skewed towards a happy, successful, positively coping with stress sort of image, right? And sometimes what that can do for us is that we might feel like there's something wrong with us, that we are unable to cope in the same way. So this is what we call an upward comparison, where we look at people who seem to be doing better than us and wondering why we cannot be like them. And in a situation like this, there is no right or wrong way to be responding to the crisis. Everybody has different sets of circumstances. Everybody has their own challenges. What people put on social media is a fraction of what their day-to-day life is like. But it's hard to remember this sometimes when we are bombarded with images of people suddenly learning new skills or being able to manage everything beautifully. So it's important that if we are being affected by seeing these things online, and that might not be all of us, only some of us might feel that way, but it's completely fine for you to feel that way as well, because we do have the tendency to compare, and those comparisons can make us feel bad about ourselves. So what we want to do is also potentially limit our exposure to those sorts of accounts. That's completely fine. You don't have to unfollow them forever. You can just unfollow them for the time being until you feel like you're in a better place, and then you can refollow some of these people. But the point being that you want to stay away from things that are unnecessarily making you feel bad, and for no reason, because there is actually nothing wrong with how you're coping necessarily. If all you can manage is, at the end of the day, having a cup of tea by yourself, that's completely fine, a completely fine way to cope. It doesn't have to be learning a new skill or improving on other skills or being able to pick up a dance move. Absolutely not necessary for you to be doing that in order to be coping well with the situation. So make the judgments, see if anything like this is affecting you, and then make the choice of whether you want to continue following them for the time being. Moving on. So apart from sort of limiting our exposure to negativity, we also want to try and see if there's a way to focus on things that are good that happen throughout the day. So practice focusing on positive things helps us to become more attuned to them. Like in the same way that focusing on negative things makes us more attuned to negative things, focusing on the positive helps us learn to be positive as well. So paying attention to small things, so they don't need to be very, very big things like somebody sending you a cat package or something like that. It could be small things like your child was very happy with the breakfast that you made. And that just paying attention to that joy that they had in that moment can help us sort of notice later on when they are happy when we do things for them, right? Another thing that we can do as well is, instead of sharing the negative content, find things that make you laugh, make your children laugh, make your husband laugh, and share those inside jokes with each other. Some of you will have family WhatsApp chats and so on. Try and populate those with things that amuse you, that make you feel good. So music, cartoons, jokes, so that everybody is sort of oriented towards things that are a little bit more positive. If it's possible, and this is something that you want to do as well, a gratitude reflection is something that's also useful. This is not necessarily to be like, I am grateful for every single thing that happened that day, whether it's good or bad. It's just to help us recognize that there were things throughout the day that went better than we anticipated, because when we're very stressed and we're very busy, we sometimes overlook the good things that happen because we're not really trained as human beings to pay attention to good. We're usually trained to pay attention to threat. So we kind of have to practice at noticing the good things that happen. So a gratitude reflection is one of those ways that we can actually look back on our day and see, actually there were more things that happened that I can see were positive than I had actually noticed throughout the day. So that's another way in which you can learn to start noticing the smaller things. Other things you can do as well is, if you have a friend or a family member who you know tends to be a little bit more positive, you can maybe spend more time talking with somebody like that. And even if you have problems to talk to them about, they are more likely to give you a perspective that isn't always doom and gloom, and could give you a different way of seeing things that is more optimistic, perhaps. Also, another thing that is actually quite good and speaks to sort of our wider human nature is focusing on acts of kindness. So not necessarily just what we do that is kind or what others do for us that is kind, although those things are very good and also feed into our gratitude reflections. Is, when you look at things like Humans of New York on Facebook, or you follow this animal rescue pages where you see that there's a lot of goodness and kindness in the world, that people are helping each other, and those things as well can be really uplifting. So they don't need to actually happen directly to us, but just watching other people be kind to each other can also give us a sense of optimism and hope in the situations that we're in. So those are things that you can also try and pay more attention to when they come up on your screens. And finally, for this one, and I think most importantly, is practicing what we call self-compassion, meaning that we tend to expect more from ourselves than we do other people. And a lot of the time, because of that, we rarely ever meet our own expectations about the kind of wife, colleague, daughter, mother, sister that we should be. So when we do that, we often end up beating ourselves up. And that is usually the biggest source of stress for a lot of us, because when we benchmark ourselves, we end up feeling like we've not done enough. So practicing self-compassion means usually seeing whether our benchmark is even realistic to begin with. Would we expect the same from a friend who is in a similar situation? Would we expect them to be on top of things all the time, or would we be more willing to cut them some slack? And usually we will find that that's true. If it was a friend, we would say, don't worry about it. You have a lot on your plate. It's okay if you let something slip. So try and use the same principle when you are talking to yourselves or evaluating yourself at the end of the day, and tell yourself that you do actually have a lot to manage. There is a lot on your plate, and you might not always be able to be on top of everything all the time, but that's okay, because you're only human and there's only so much that you can do. So if you practice doing that on a daily basis, it might not always sit well, or you won't feel comfortable, but after a while you'll find that you learn to be kinder to yourself, and that can be another very effective way of managing stress. So the second last tip that I have is about exercise. And this is one that people do talk about, but I'm going to talk about the benefits of exercise, because a lot of us know that it's good, but we don't take it seriously enough to actually do it. But it is an important thing to try and see if you can incorporate into your daily schedule, both for yourself as well as the rest of your family, because exercise is one of the most effective ways of managing stress for several reasons. If you recall, I mentioned that stress is actually a physiological response to our environments. And what exercise does is it manages the physiological aspects of stress, which can go very far to reducing acute stress. So first thing it does is it rechannels our fight or flight response. So that energy, the nervous energy that we get out of being stressed, becomes part of the exercise, right? So then we have an outlet for where that energy can flow. Exercise also increases our blood flow to the brain and therefore oxygen as well to the brain, which gives us greater clarity and helps our brain form the neural connections that we need to be able to maintain optimal function. It increases our fitness levels as well, which then allows us to do more in less time over time. It boosts our immune system responses because, again, the increased circulation and so on actually helps with moving things through your body. Another side benefit is that if you have children, it does tend to burn off the excess energy, which then will make them a little bit easier to handle. And also, just in general, it improves both physical and psychological functioning because exercise releases endorphins, which are hormones that create positive emotions in us. So that also helps to relieve symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression. So all of these are very significant benefits of exercise. So if you can even schedule half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour a day for you to do some exercise or for your family to do some exercises together, there's plenty now online to follow, whether it's on Instagram or on YouTube that are family-based. It's a good thing to get everyone moving because the MCO is making us a lot more sedentary. So apart from the stress alleviation elements, it will help also with the physical side of things. And then finally, this is something that a lot of us forego because we feel that we need to put the needs of others before our own. So making time for inspiration basically is about finding the things that give us meaning and purpose and following through with doing those. So for some of us, it might be having the time to read or to sew or to create something. So identifying those activities, making time for them, scheduling them in, and then making sure that we follow through, that we don't compromise on the time that we allocate for these activities. Because again, very much like with the self-compassion element, we need to take care of ourselves and our own mental health in order to be able to be there, be present fully for the people that depend on us. So these things are not about us being selfish and taking time for ourselves. It's actually us taking care of ourselves so that we can then take care of the people around us. So again, this is something that if you have a routine, can be scheduled in, and this is a boundary that you can explain to people about that is solely for you. This is a me time activity, basically, that's going to help you stay grounded and feel like you have done something that's meaningful throughout the day or the week and give you something to look forward to as well. So just to conclude, the three things that we want to basically take away from this is that whenever we want to cope with stress, especially during a crisis situation, we want to be able to communicate well with people, as mutual understanding can help to reduce the sense of anxiety and uncertainty that we experience throughout the day. We also want to be able to plan properly because our days become so blended into each other that sometimes it's hard to find structure. So these boundaries and routines can help us to focus on one thing at a time and makes decision making a lot easier. And finally, we want to also follow through on the plans that we come up with, because this then allows us to model the behaviors that we want our family to learn from us as well, particularly in the aspects of self-care and self-compassion. So if our family can see that we are kinder to ourselves and therefore also kinder in understanding them, those are lessons that they can learn in helping to manage their own stress as well. So yes, so these are the few tips that I have. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask? This would be the right time. Elaine, you mentioned something earlier about having to look at something positive in this whole COVID-19, the lockdown that we're all facing.
Yeah.
I want to share my experience too, because my children already adults, and all too soon they grew up very fast, and they were doing their own thing, and I realized I did not have that much time to spend with them.
Mm.
And you know something? This has suddenly become the a good thing, because suddenly my kids are back home and I'm spending a lot of time. We're doing a lot of talking. If not, I would not have this opportunity.
Yeah.
Think forward now, a year, 2 years from now. Would you actually think this is all negative, all bad? Not necessarily, because I will not give up this time that I'm spending with my family. I know there are a lot of other stresses, but these are part of the positives that I can take from this lockdown. That I can spend time. I become a better cook. Don't ask about my waistline though, but there's so many good things that I've learned from this. Learning all those recipes that I always wanted to do, and we keep saying no time, no time. Well, now we do have some time actually.
Yeah. So Raymond, that's a very good application of the gratitude reflection exercise. So that's the sort of thing that we would like to try and do on a daily basis if possible. It's okay if you forget every now and then, but whenever you remember, it's a good idea to sort of take stock and identify these things. Some of them might seem a bit small, but it's the small things that eventually add up and help us to see that our lives aren't always 100% negative, and that can actually slowly help us to orient towards having a more positive mindset.
Okay. Anyone from Sri Bastari would like to say a few words? Miss Komal, head of primary, I'd like to call upon you if you'd like to say a few words, Miss Komal.
Thank you, Mr. Raymond. Thank you, Miss Elaine, for this sharing session with us. I feel that it's definitely a very good opportunity for us, especially educators in this field, to see how are the ways that we can also cope and channel our stress into positive ways. Thank you very much to help University for this partnership on this talk. We hope to have many more in the future. Thank you very much on behalf of SBS. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr.
Elaine,
Yeah.
Elaine, I received a question here by
Okay.
WhatsApp. I'm not going to paraphrase the whole question, but I'm going to read it as it is.
All right, sure.
It says here, as teachers, we are so stressed to meet the demands of the students, the parents, and the bosses, inverted comma, because we are result oriented. The problem is sometimes we hope we can go back to face-to-face teaching so that we can assess our students and see if they are really in class and doing their work.
Yeah.
So how do we overcome such stress? Is this something to do with practicing self-compassion?
Yes. I think one of the things that we do have to recognize is that the move online, I think for most of us has been in reaction, right, to the COVID-19 situation, and therefore we were not as prepared as we would otherwise like to be. So all these contingencies about how do we monitor that our students are actually following through on activities, how some of us might be concerned that they might not have parents at home who might be able to help them. Their parents might be very busy, so the children are kind of left floundering. So understandably, you will have a lot of concerns for your students and their progress. And also, I think for a lot of you, their own state of mind and how they're coping and so on and so forth, above and beyond their studies. So these are very real concerns and very genuine concerns of educators. I think but one of the things that we need to do as well, and this is in line with, as you mentioned, self-compassion, is to evaluate what is really within our power to control at this point in time. How much help are we capable of extending? And is it really in our hands, right? So we do what we can. We put into place all the contingency planning. We try and create activities that are as accessible as possible for them. But understand as well that during this period, some of them may not get the same benefit as they would if they were with you in the physical classroom. And we need to learn to be okay with that, given the situation. given that it's unprecedented and that really is no solution for that at this point in time. So I think we need to also understand that we have to be doing our best. If our best feels like it's not enough, that's not necessarily our fault. There are other circumstances at play that are preventing us from being able to do what we would like to do. So just accepting that, and if we would want to do anything better, just looking at what we've been doing and see if there are ways of refining, maybe having conversations with colleagues about what we can do better, sharing experiences to see if there are other ideas. If you have the time, and again, this is not something that you have to beat yourself up for if you can't do, but if you do have the time, you can also see what people are doing in other countries. There are plenty of now online teaching and learning courses about how to approach things creatively for different age groups. So those are things that maybe people can get together and explore different courses and share your experiences if this is something you want to do. But also, very, very importantly, understanding that as one individual, we cannot save everybody. We cannot be responsible for everybody. We can only do the best we can within our capacity, and that is also taking into consideration our own health and our own mental health. So if something is already impinging into your ability to self-care, then it might be important as well to take a step back and sort of look after yourself first. Then once you feel a little bit more on top of things, it might then give you a little bit more space in your mind to be able to look for options then. So it's okay to take a step back, take care of yourself, and then reapproach the problem after the fact. Because taking that step back might actually give you more perspective. But yeah, this is not easy. Being an educator myself, I completely empathize with what you've just said about having pressures from various sides and also still trying to do the best we can by our students. So but the important thing is to remember that we are one person, and there's only so much an individual can do.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Greg, there's a question from Yoga.
There's another. Yeah, there's a question here. Hi, Elaine. May I ask how we can better manage relationship while maintaining social distancing? I understand we can hug or kiss our loved one for some time. So how do you convey this to our loved ones?
Okay, so I'm assuming these are people that you don't live with. So I mean, within the same house, you should still be able to hug and kiss each other because you're already touching the same things daily anyway. But I'm assuming it's people that you maybe want to drop off items to and things like that, and you don't want to have physical contact, which is completely understandable. I think it's important to remember that it's not that we don't want to hug or kiss our loved ones. It's basically more that we're trying to protect them, especially those of us who have elderly parents or family members who are more at risk. So for example, my brother has asthma, so I have not seen him for the whole of the MCO, even though he lives 5 minutes away from me. But basically the idea is that we tell them and we are very clear with them that it's not out of any desire not to see them, or that we don't want to hug them or we don't want to kiss them. It's just that we know that for this time, it's in their best interest and in everyone's best interest that we don't convey our affection in a physical way. We can maybe write to them more often, call them more often, video chat, WhatsApp, even if it's not a conversation, sending them a picture or a video that reminds you of them is a way to communicate to them that they are in your thoughts, that they are still a valued part of your life, even though you cannot interact with them in the same way that you are used to. But obviously be very clear with them that as soon as things are safe, they're going to get very bad help from you. But for the time being, we will communicate how much we love each other electronically, and do small things like I said, sending them things throughout the day to show that, hey, I'm thinking of you, I'm thinking of you. That's another way of helping them realize that we are still very much in contact, and we still care very much about them. It's
Okay. It's true. We may not be able to connect physically, but we can always send chat messages to cheer people up. You can make plans of what you want to do after the MCO is over, where you can go, what food you want to eat, or places you want to travel to. All these things to excite friends and family that they are still part of your lives in the future, even if it's not at the present time, only physically. Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions you'd like to ask? Greg, do you have any other things?
No, there's all the questions from the meeting chat, and one that came
Okay.
through my WhatsApp, which I posted just now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to find my. Never mind. I think I tell you what. I'm going to. Can you see my feedback form? Are you seeing
No,
my
Ren.
feedback?
You're not sharing your screen.
Can't seem to put that up. Never mind. I'm going to give it to Yoga to send it out. Is that okay, Yoga? I'll send it to you. I don't want to keep everybody waiting. I would like to say thank you to Elaine. Thank you to the team from Sri Bastari. And I appreciate that all of you have joined us for this for this invaluable session by Elaine. And we hope that Help University has been able to solve some of your problems and bring down your stress level to a certain extent. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. It was great talking to you, and I do hope that you were able to take away some useful pointers from today's session.